Have you ever wondered what really happened to José de Egypt after his death? Where did your body rested? And why their bones became a symbol of an eternal promise of God? This is not just an ancient story. It is a spiritual key that can unlock something deep in your faith today. Because what you are about to discover is not taught anywhere. Few know the truth that hides behind the final destination of Joseph, the man who was betrayed by his brothers, raised by God, and whose life is a living prophecy. Many believe that when someone dies, their story ends. But José's story demonstrates the opposite. His death was the beginning of a legacy that would change the history of a nation. And if you are going through a season of silence, forgotten, or waiting, this message can be exactly what your soul needs. Today you will understand why God allowed every detail in Joseph's life, and how his death hides one of the most powerful lessons in the entire Bible. Stay until the end, because what you will discover can transform your way of seeing suffering, waiting, and divine promises. You will understand why Joseph is a prophetic figure of Jesus Christ, and how his bones, centuries later, marked the exact fulfillment of a word that seemed forgotten. Don't go, because this knowledge will not only illuminate your mind, it will turn on your faith. If you love the Bible, if you believe in Jesus, and want to grow in your relationship with God, this video is for you. And before starting, write me in the comments. Did you know that Joseph's bones were taken out of Egypt centuries after his death? Did you ever hear this story in detail? Your opinion can awaken faith in others. So like the video, subscribe to the channel and activate the notifications, because we are going to immerse ourselves together in one of the most powerful and revealing stories of the scriptures. Let's start right now. José, the beloved son of Jacob and Raquel, had a life marked by unexpected twists that, although painful, were aligned with God's perfect plan. From his childhood, he was pointed out by a special grace. His prophetic dreams and his close relationship with his father generated intense jealousy among his brothers, who, consumed by envy, made the drastic decision to throw it into a well and sell as a slave. But what seemed like an irreversible tragedy was, in reality, the beginning of a divine purpose. In Genesis 39:2 we read, "More Jehovah was with Joseph, and it was a prosperous male." What a powerful promise. Although physically descended to the abyss, it was spiritually elevated by its unwavering faith. Have you ever felt caught in an emotional or spiritual well? Just as Joseph, even in the darkest moments, God never departs from us. While living in Egypt, far from his family and his land, José was sold to Potiphar, a Pharaoh officer. There, again, he demonstrated his full character, refusing to sin with his master's wife, despite the consequences. He was unjustly accused and imprisoned, but still, he did not renegade his faith or doubt the purpose of God. What the strongest testimony of spiritual perseverance. Instead of surrendering, he trusted. In the midst of the prison, he interpreted the dreams of the cupbeat and the baker of the Pharaoh, thus opening a door to his destination. And you? What do you do when everything seems unfair? Do you renege or cling to the promises of the Bible? Joseph shows us that God's processes do not always have human logic, but always lead to their glory. When Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret, it was José who by divine grace revealed its meaning. 7 years of abundance followed by 7 scarcity. His discernment, guided by God, not only saved Egypt from hunger, but also positioned him as a second in the kingdom, barely under the Pharaoh, from the well to the palace. This ascent was no accident, but promises. Sometimes God allows us to go through humiliations before leading us to exaltation. Philippians 2:9 says, "Therefore God also exalted him to most," speaking of Jesus Christ. And in José, we see that same pattern. Humiliation, followed by honor. Isn't this a prefigure of Jesus himself, rejected by his people, but glorified by the Father? When reuniting with his brothers during the Great Famine, José had the opportunity to take revenge. But instead, he forgave and cried with them. This attitude was not born of emotion, but of a life cultivated in faith. In Genesis 50:20, José declares, "You thought badly against me, but God directed him well." What a powerful revelation. When we trust God, even what seems like a deadly blow can become a redemptive blessing. Jose understood that his suffering had a greater purpose, preserving lives. And you? Can you see beyond your wounds and recognize that God can transform your pain into purpose? Its history is just an ancient story. It is a living guide for those who want to walk with God today. It reminds us that loyalty to the Word, confidence in divine promises, and humility in the face of evidence are key to living a victorious life. Jose was not perfect, but it was constant, and that made it an instrument of the kingdom. If you are in a difficult time today, remember that your palace can be closer to what you imagine. But before arriving, you may have to cross your own well, as Jose did. And that is where we begin to understand that the path of the chosen ones is not easy, but full of purpose. Let's see now how the last days of this man of faith were. The last days of Joseph were not of fear or uncertainty, but of deep certainty in God's promises. Already old, with 110 years, an age that for the Egyptians symbolized a full life, Joseph did not let himself be wrapped by the riches of the palace or the riches of the empire. On the contrary, his heart was still connected to his parents' inheritance, with the faith he had learned from Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. Despite having lived most of his life in Egypt, Jose never let his Hebrew identity dilute. He knew that his soul belonged to God, and that is why, in his last moments, he did something extraordinary. He prophesied. Yes, even at the time of death, his faith spoke higher. Hebrews 11:22 is written, "By faith Joseph, when he died, he mentioned the departure of the children of Israel and gave a command on their bones." That statement summarizes a life of hope. Joseph did not fear death because he knew that his story was just a part of something much bigger, the fulfillment of God's promises. Instead of lamenting for the end of his life, he used his last sighs to strengthen the faith of future generations. He not only believed that God would visit his people, but declared it with authority. "God will certainly visit you, and you will bring my bones from here." Genesis 50:25. It is as if I said, "I will not see the promised land, but you do. And when that happens, take me with you." What a deeper act of trust. How many, when facing death, despair, but Jose, with his eyes closing, still talked about liberation, promise, of the future. His faith did not go out with old age. On the contrary, it burned with more intensity. The fascinating thing about this moment is that Joseph, even in the midst of an Egyptian context, full of pagan idols and customs, remained firm in the faith of the single God. He did not ask for pyramids, temples, or monuments. He only made an order to be remembered as part of the people of God. That simple desire revealed its deep connection with the divine promise and its absolute trust in which God's plan would not be unfinished. When someone has a living relationship with the Word, he understands that death is not the end, but a transition. Jose did not say goodbye sadly, but with a clear message. This does not end here. And how many today need to hear that? Faith in Jesus Christ not only gives us eternal life, but also purpose here and now. What Jose sowed in his death was a seed of hope for an entire nation. His statement was remembered centuries later by Moses and later by Joshua, demonstrating that a word based on faith, said under the guidance of the Spirit, can cross generations. It is impressive how true faith is not limited to the present moment, but leaves eternal traces. Joseph understood that his life had been useful, not because of the positions he occupied, but for the fidelity with which he walked with God. When looking back, he did not attach to the glories of the throne, but to the promises of the Bible. How beautiful it would be for all of us to approach at the end of our day. We had that peace, that certainty, that communion with God that Joseph had. And so, while his body began to get tired, his spirit continued to raise the people. His last words were not complaints or nostalgia, but prophecies. Jose died as he lived, with faith, and his death was not an end point, but a point often in the history of God's people. But the most curious thing is what happened later with his body, with those bones that would become a symbol of promise and divine fidelity, because the way he was buried would reveal not only his honor among the Egyptians, but also their spiritual resistance as the Son of the Most High. Let's see how that detail, apparently simple, encloses a deep revelation about eternity and hope in God's promises. The death of Joseph was not treated as that of a slave or that of a simple foreigner. It was embalmed and placed in a sarcophagus worthy of the great princes of Egypt. That reveals something shocking. Even in a culture that did not adore the God of Israel, Joseph was honored for his integrity, wisdom, and leadership. He was treated, solemnly, like a man who saved an entire nation of hunger. But the most amazing thing is that, although they covered him with Egyptian funeral practices, his heart never turned away from his faith in the living God. Even among incense, amulets, and pagan rituals, Jose remained a faithful Hebrew, and his soul did not belong to the pharaohs, but to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What a beautiful contrast, surrounded by the mundane, but clinging to the eternal. In Egyptian culture, embalsamar was a sacred act that preserved the body with the hope of life after death. But Jose did not need such preservation to ensure his eternity. He did not trust oils or gold tombs, but in the promises of God. The Bible does not stop in details of the sarcophagus, but it does highlight its key instruction, that their bones were taken to Canaan when the people left Egypt. It is as if I were saying, my body can rest here for a while, but my soul already has direction. The promised land. What a statement of faith. Joseph knew that what God promises he fulfills, and his grave in Egypt was just a temporary pause on an eternal journey. It is interesting to see how his burial not only connected two peoples, Israel and Egypt, but also two visions, earthly, glory and heavenly hope. The Egyptians saw Joseph as a symbol of human wisdom, the Hebrews as a living testimony of God's fidelity. His embalmed body rested between two worlds, and that reflected his mission, to unite the natural with the spiritual, the visible with the eternal. And how many today, like Jose, feel trapped between two worlds? He teaches us that you can live in a system without belonging to it, influence without being contaminated, serve without compromising faith. His death also represents a turning point. Through your burial, a silent pact is sealed. Do not forget who they are. Do not forget where they are going. His body rested, but his testimony spoke. Every generation that saw that sarcophagus knew that there was still a promise to be fulfilled. It was a physical reminder of spiritual hope. Jose became, even dead, a silent prophet who pointed to the future. As a voice that, from the grave, repeated, God will visit them. And that challenges us today. What spiritual legacy are we leaving? Are our lives pointing to the kingdom as Jose did? And so, while Egypt wrapped him with honors, heaven received him as a faithful servant. His body was buried, yes, but his promise was alive. Because what would come later would not only affect his grave, but a whole nation. A new pharaoh would rise, one who did not know Jose or respected his legacy. The atmosphere would change dramatically, and that silent grave, witness of honor and faith, would soon be surrounded by chains and oppression. But before pain dominated, God had already sown hope. We will now understand how the stage changed of the recognition of slavery. After the death of Jose, the atmosphere in Egypt began to change slowly, as if the memories of the past were buried along with their sarcophagus. The Bible in Exodus 1:8 mentions that a new king was raised on Egypt who did not know Joseph. This phrase, so brief, encloses a transcendental historical turn. The honor became oblivion. The man who had saved Egypt from hunger was set aside by a generation that no longer valued his history or his God. This new pharaoh, not knowing Joseph, also did not recognize God's hand over the Hebrew people. And so the decline begins. The transition from respect for suspicion, of gratitude, to slavery. How many times do we forget what God has done when leadership, season, or environment changes? What was before a respected people became seen as a threat. The new Pharaoh feared that the children of Israel would multiply too much, and that is why he imposed loads, forced labor, and oppression. But what he did not understand is that the growth of a people blessed by God cannot stop. The more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied. Exodus 1:12. This reveals a spiritual principle. Faith is strengthened under pressure. Sometimes God allows us to go through fire not to destroy us but to purify us. Hosea had lived injustice before, and now his entire people experienced it. But the same. God who had exalted it was preparing a new intervention, an even more powerful release. The figure of Hosea disappears from the scene, but his spiritual legacy remains a seed hidden on earth. Although his name was no longer remembered in Los Palacios, his testimony continued to inspire his people. It is possible that many Hebrews, seeing Joseph's tomb, remembered his words, "God will certainly visit you." That promise, repeated in the midst of slavery, fed hope. How many times do we feel forgotten by men? But do we know that we have not been forgotten by God? Just as Pharaoh did not know Joseph, perhaps the world does not recognize your value, your faith, your service. But God, yes. And in the perfect time, he manifests. Egyptian oppression was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. History of faith is full of moments when what seemed defeat was, in fact, preparation. God had not abandoned his people. I was preparing a liberator, Moses. And it is moving to think that in the midst of slavery, the people still kept tradition, faith, oral Bible, promises alive. They had no temples, but they had memory. They had no freedom but a prophetic word. And you? Do you stand firm when everything seems to go against? Hosea did not need applause to stay faithful, and his people, even oppressed, did not release his spiritual inheritance. It is here that the silence of God becomes expectation. Oppression intensifies, but also the need for redemption. The clamor of the children of Israel climbed to heaven, and the God who had been with Joseph in jail, in the well and in the palace, was also with them in the middle of the bricks and the whip. What nobody imagined was that shortly, Joseph's bones would begin to move again, not because of the power of men, but because of divine fidelity. We are going to discover how that promise that seemed buried is fulfilled centuries later, in a scene full of faith and redemption. Centuries passed from the death of Hosea, and his sarcophagus remained there as a silent shadow of the past in some corner of Egypt. But for God, promises do not expire. Time does not erase what he has decreed. Joseph's faith was not buried with him. It was preserved as a seed waiting for the exact moment to flourish. And that moment came. When Moses was raised by God to lead the exodus of the children of Israel, one of the first acts recorded by the Bible is deeply symbolic. Moses took Joseph's bones, Exodus 13:19. What a powerful scene. Among so many priorities, in the midst of hurry to leave Egypt, Moses did not forget the body of the one who had prophesied freedom. This was not a ceremonial gesture. It was an act of obedience, honor, and above all, of faith. Wearing Joseph's bones was more than moving mortal remains. It was loading a living promise. It was to remember that the faithfulness of God transcends generations. Joseph had died with a vision in the heart, see his free people, and on the earth, that God had promised. Although he did not see him with his eyes, his spirit declared him. And now, those bones were witnesses that faith is not in vain. In the midst of an entire nation that came out of slavery, there was a sarcophagus that marched with them. What a shocking image, as if saying, God fulfills what he promises. How many today need to walk with that same spirit, believing that, although we do not see the immediate answer, what God says, he does. Throughout the journey through the desert, Hosea's bones accompanied the people, not as a burden, but as a constant reminder of divine fidelity. Every time the fatigue hit, every time the doubt wanted to enter, there was that silent testimony. Hosea believed, and here we are. It is as if his presence brought spiritual strength, like a prophetic echo that encouraged not to surrender. And you? Do you have promise bones that you need to load with you? Words that God gave you and that have not yet been fulfilled? Do not bury them in oblivion. Charger them with you. Tell them. Remember them. Because if God said it, God will do it. Finally, when arriving in Canaan, already under the leadership of Joshua, Hosea's bones were buried in Sichem, in the land that Jacob had bought centuries before. Joshua 24:32. With that act, a prophetic cycle was closed that had begun with a dreamy boy and culminated with an entire nation entering his destiny. It was no coincidence that burial occurred on a field bought by his father, as if God said, "This place belongs to them. This legacy is yours." Jose's faith materialized. His vision was completed. What were remains for the world, for the people of God, was compliance. And so, the bones that one day rested in Egypt were planted in the land of promise, not as a corpse, but as a seed that would continue to bear fruit. Because when we walk in faith, even after our departure, our words, our actions, and our hope continue to speak. Jose was a man whose faith did not know the limit of death, and what would come next would be even deeper, a reflection on the true spiritual meaning of his death, a lesson that goes beyond history and directly touches our lives today. Joseph's death was not simply the closure of a biography, but the opening of an eternal legacy. His life did not end in Egypt because his faith projected him much beyond the grave. Joseph lived more in God's promises than in the riches of Egypt. Although he had everything to stick to power and comfort, his heart was in the Word. He understood that his true identity was not in his position, but in his relationship with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In Hebrews 11, we find him in the gallery of the heroes of faith, not for his dreams, nor for his political conquests, but for a seemingly simple decision, to speak of God's promise before he died. What a depth! Jose did not die lamenting, but prophesying. His last act was an act of trust, of spiritual vision, of absolute certainty in the character of God. And that is where Joseph's life becomes a mirror for us. Where is our trust placed? In what we have or what God has said? Jose chose to believe. He did not hold on to Egypt because he knew his inheritance was not there. The Maduro believer learns not to put his roots on this earth, but in eternity. Jesus said in Matthew 6:19-21, "Do not make treasures on earth, but do treasures in heaven, because where your treasure is, there will also be your heart." Jose lived exactly like that. His treasure was not the Pharaoh ring, but the faithfulness of God. And still dead, his bones spoke. Because when a life is lived by faith, even death can silence your message. Another powerful lesson that leaves us is the value of remaining faithful even in foreign lands. Jose was a foreigner all his life. His language, his culture, his faith, everything he was, contrasted with the world that surrounded him. And yet, he never negotiated his identity. It is easy to be a Christian surrounded by other believers, but what happens when we are in the midst of a society that denies God? Jose demonstrates that it is possible to stay pure, complete, and fervent, even when all systems are against. Its history reminds us that faith does not adapt, resists. It does not hide, it shines. It is not diluted, transforms. In a world where many surrender to the pressure, Jose chose to stand up, and that firmness was what made God exalted. In addition, Joseph's life points to someone much older, Jesus Christ. Rejected by his brothers, sold by coins, unjustly humiliated, but then exalted to the top. Just as Joseph saved his people from hunger, Jesus came to save us from sin. Jose forgave those who betrayed him. Jesus from the cross forgave those who crucified him. Jose was a prophetic shadow of the Redeemer, and that was no accident. The entire Bible is intertwined with symbols, figures, and parallels that point to Jesus. Joseph's life is an anticipated gospel, a portrait of the Messiah that would come. Do you realize? Its history is not only historical, it is spiritual. It is a living teaching for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. And finally, Jose leaves us a model of how to die well, not with fear but with purpose, not with attachment to the earthly, but with the eyes put in the eternal. Today, more than ever, we need that kind of faith, one that crosses generations, that inspires others to remain firm to the last breath. His life, his death, and his legacy shout us that it is worth trusting in God, even if we do not see the promise fulfilled in life, because if he said it, he will. And with this, we close the last chapter of this story. But we now prepare to reveal something that you may never have considered about everything you just heard. And now I ask you, What part of the story of Jose touched your heart more? Was your faith unwavering? His forgiveness to those who betrayed him? Or the fulfillment of a promise centuries after his death? Leave me your answer in the comments, because I want to know how this revelation hit your spiritual life. Don't keep this just for you. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that God never forgets his promises. And if you have not done so, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Here we talk about issues that strengthen your faith, which connect you with the Bible and bring you more to Jesus Christ. Do not miss the next contents, because revelations come that can completely transform your way of walking with God. And now on the screen, you have the next recommended video. Click and discover another biblical story that is full of deep teachings for your spiritual life. Don't leave it for later. I am a framework, and it was an honor to share this word with you. See you in the next video, and God bless you powerfully.